You know, and speech is really something that does separate us in an important way from animals, you know, like we haven't got very far teaching animals how to speak. The best we've managed so far is some parrots, right? There's a gray African parrot. There was one of them that got up to about a 4-year-old level, and that's mind-boggling, because like how big is the brain of a parrot? It's like that big, and that bloody thing could talk, and so that shows you how much we know about brains. But I know they're small and all that, and we tried teaching chimpanzees to talk, and they could kind of get somewhere with sign language, especially if you started when they were young, but they don't have the capacity for language like we do, and they were never able to really pass it on to the next generation, which is obviously a critical element of really having that ability. So human beings, we've used our linguistic capacity to parse up the world in a new way and to conceptualize it in a new way. And you know, you can say that we're just like ants on this little trivial planet out on the edge of one of 100 million galaxies, and that what's happening here has no cosmic significance. But that's an arbitrary proposition, you know. I mean, we're very complicated things, and whatever's going on this planet has to do with conscious reality. And the transformations of consciousness, for all we know, might be the most important things that happen everywhere. There's no reason to consider consciousness a trivial phenomena. I mean, it's taken 3.5 billion years for you to develop the brain that you've developed. And human beings are amazing creatures. I mean, just a casual walk through YouTube and all those crazy kids that climb cranes and do that. What's that? Yeah, parkour, man. That stuff's unbelievable, you know? I mean, human beings are crazy, crazy animals. There's almost nothing we can't do. And I'm very loath to assume that the transformations of consciousness that are described in the early stories in the biblical accounts are somehow cosmically trivial. It doesn't strike me that way, and it's certainly not self-evident. And even if they are cosmically trivial, whatever that means, the rocks don't care what you think. Well, who cares what the rocks think? First, they don't think. So I don't see why that's exactly relevant. But even if it's all the same to the cosmos, which is something that I doubt, it's certainly not just all the same to you, you know, because your consciousness has a quality and it matters. Heidegger, for example, who's a philosopher whose writing sort of influenced me post hoc, because I recreated some of the things that he had talked about in the 30s before I knew much about him. But one of the things that Heidegger said was that the fundamental element of human being, of human phenomenology, was care. He said that that's the basic essence of your being, is that you care about things. You know, and that's either negatively or positively, right? To not care about something or to hate it is still to be involved in care. And so, even if the cosmos itself is neutral with regards to our existence, we're not, and we're the only things that we know of that are conscious, and so, well, we might as well go with that. And there's no reason. See, I can't help but think that the constant attempts by people to trivialize the nature of their own consciousness has a dark side. I'm a psychoanalyst, and so I always think that way. It's like, well, first of all, if you as a being don't matter, then you don't have to do anything. It's a great justification for total lack of responsibility. And that really twigs something for me, because, you know, people who are bent, let's say, or vengeful or angry are always looking for a reason why they don't have to be responsible for anything. Plus it's a lot easier. And so the notion that consciousness is trivial immediately allows you to wander down that path. And so I'm skeptical of those claims. And I also think that there's a deep hatred of humanity that underlies those claims as well. And I read my YouTube comments sometimes, you know, and I've always been annoyed that, you know, because I've heard like sort of radical, clueless environmentalists say things like the planet would be better off without people on it, which is something that, like, you just cannot say that. If you say that and listen to yourself, you should like go to a monastery for like 3 years and never say a word and have a shower every 10 minutes until you've learned your lesson properly. You know, you can't utter a more genocidal phrase than that, you know. And of course you always do it in a display of your care for the world. It's like, well, if we just didn't have any people, it's like, well, we'll just line them all up and shoot them with machine guns. No, it's really sickening. It's appalling. and there's a hatred for humanity that's at the bottom of it. And I mean, you can kind of understand why, because we're messy and, you know, we don't clean up after ourselves and, you know, we're like raping the rainforests and that sort of thing. But I do have some sympathy for people because, you know, we're hell on Mother Nature, but she certainly returns the favor, so. And that's a good thing to remember. You know, a lot of what we're doing is just bloody well trying to exist with a relative minimum of pain. And we're doing our best to get, you know, to get as good at doing that as fast as we can. And that's not an easy thing. There are lots of us, and like life is bloody complicated. And the other thing that happens too is, again, if you scratch just beneath the surface of people, and this is something that's always, you know, to me has been a kind of miracle, is if you talk to someone, they're out doing their job, and maybe they're doing a good job at it, like some emergency room nurse, you know, it's, God, there's a job for you. Or maybe they work in palliative care. You know, and you talk to them and you find out they've got like 4, as I said before, serious problems in their family, and maybe they're diabetic to boot, and yet they haul themselves out of bed in the morning and go take care of dying people. It's like, good God, people deserve a bit of respect for struggling forward and not always trying to make the planet a worse place when they're beset on all sides constantly by, you know, an unending series of tragedy. You'd think we could have a little bit of sympathy for ourselves as a consequence of that. It's like we're not all like rapacious, greedy monsters who are bent on just devouring everything in our path, you know. It's a little bit more complicated than that. So, all right, anyway, so let's go to the next part of this here. All right, so, and God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so, and God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning the second day. Well, to understand that, because that doesn't make any sense at all, really. So I think I told you a little bit about this before. So the world that's being created in this particular account is a phenomenological world. There's a disk of land, because if you go out in a field and you look around, you're on a disk of land, so that's pretty obvious. And then there's a dome on top of it. It's more or less held up by the mountains, and rain comes down, so there's water above the dome, because where else would the rain come from? And underneath the ground, there's fresh water. You can drill down and find that. And then around that, there's salt water, and so that's the world. And it's kind of an empirical world, because if you're a child and you just go out in a field and you look at the world, that's sort of what it would be like. And so that's the world that's being created. And so one of the things that is worth thinking about, and this is something Carl Jung was very interested in, is that these old descriptions are half geographical and half empirical, so sort of based on observation, and half psychological. So one of the things Jung was interested in, for example, was astrology, but mostly for a psychological reason, because, you know, there are stars up on the dome, and then when you look at the stars, you can imagine the shapes of the stars, and that helps you orient yourself, because as soon as you can see shapes in the stars, then you can recognize the constellations and you can orient yourself at night. But then the constellations become gods, say, and the gods turn into a drama. And the drama comes from within. It's the projection of imagination. And so when Jung was analyzing astrology, he was analyzing psychology, because he saw the astrological narrative as the projection of the human imagination onto the cosmos. And so when he was analyzing astrology, he was analyzing psychology.